Let's bring in Aaron Y. Zelen. He's an expert on jihadist groups at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thanks so much for being with us on the programme this evening. Firstly, officials said they were seeking initially additional potential suspects in this attack. That's what we were being told 24 hours ago. Why do they now believe this man was working alone, and why did they initially say the opposite?
Thanks for having me. I think part of it is based off of surveillance footage. It looked as if maybe people placed bombs on the streets as well, but it's plausible that people were just leaving their bags there to flee the scene so that they wouldn't get hurt during the attack itself. And that's why it's always important to be cautious of any reports within 24 hours of an attack to wait and see of how the investigations usually go.
And there are more than 1,000 law enforcement officers currently working on this case. How exactly will they determine whether this man had specific associations with any terrorist organisation, including ISIS, the Islamic State?
The main way they'll do this is likely looking through his phone as well as his computers to see whether he was in contact over, encrypted applications or other ways with individuals abroad, potentially. That's how we've seen it done in the past, where somebody from, say, Syria or Afghanistan or elsewhere tries to provide guidance and information. And also, one of the indicators, too, will be is if we actually see the Islamic State claim responsibility. In the past, we've seen the Islamic State sharing photographs or videos of people that have conducted attacks before they did the act, pledging allegiance to the Islamic State leader. And so if that does happen, that will be definitive proof that he was in contact with their media outlets to be able to produce this type of information.
And Aaron, you point out that the use of a car to target pedestrians, it is a typical Islamic State tactic, and it has previously been used by the jihadist group.
Yeah, in the U.S. context, we saw something in the West Side Highway in New York City back in 2017, but maybe more memorable for some people are the attacks in Nice, France, as well as in Germany almost a decade ago now during Christmas time, where these types of similar attacks have unfortunately happened as well.
And what state is the Islamic State militant group currently in? This attack, whether it was directly linked or inspired by the group, it's a stark reminder, isn't it, of the persistent threat that it and other jihadist groups continue to pose.
Depending on the particular country you're talking about, the state of the organization varies from increasing in strength in places like West Africa or in Southern Africa to being weakened in places like Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, for example. But when we're looking at it sort of as a global network, when they're doing these external attacks outside of war zones, we've seen an increased tempo of not only plots, but successful attacks over the last 18 to 24 months or so. If you'll recall, just last year, we saw those large scale ones in Iran and Russia, for example.
And we've been speaking about ISIS specifically in the context of Syria, Aaron, in the last few weeks. Many ISIS jihadists are being held in camps and detention camps, centres there, but their fate is looking increasingly uncertain, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. and the global coalition continues to operate against Islamic State cells. We've seen the U.S. conduct 4 airstrikes against the Islamic State since the takeover by the new government from the fall of the previous regime in Syria. But the detention camps as well as the IDP camps continue to be having at least 9,000 men, 40,000 women and children at least, which has not been resolved yet. Many countries have not repatriated their own citizens, and there's also many from Iraq and Syria that remained as well in these camps and detention centers. So while we haven't seen the Islamic State be able to take advantage of this new environment within Syria thus far, it still remains a worry just because of the possibility that they might try and break people out.
And observers, they've also pointed to concerns as well, Aaron, that recent events in Syria might actually be inspiring sympathisers to carry out new attacks elsewhere. Would that be something that you would agree with?
It's difficult to say because the government that took over Syria despises the Islamic State. So I don't think people would be inspired by what happened in the fall of the regime to do something on behalf of the Islamic State, because the group that took over the country, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is against the attacks outside of the Syrian context and the regime itself, or the former regime. But of course, every single day the Islamic State is putting out messages trying to get people to do attacks on its behalf. So in some ways, sometimes it's all about a matter of whether one of these things sticks with one individual. And unfortunately, in this case, in relation to the attack in New Orleans, it happened and they were successful in it.
And Aaron, you've pointed out that ISIS continually issues online propaganda, providing guidance to its followers. Are these people who commit acts of terror usually self-radicalised by the militant group, by its ideology, or are they directly enabled by the group itself or other people who are radicalised?
We see cases of both. Those who focused on this talk about inspired attacks where the individuals just essentially reading, watching the propaganda from the Islamic State and deciding to do something because the Islamic State calls for it. But then we also see another avenue, such as guided attacks, where there is a connection between the individual and the group itself, where they're talking to each other over encrypted applications online. And the Islamic State is providing distinct, specific guidance and help and pushing them to do it, and sometimes even providing funding for it as well. And that's one of the biggest questions we have going forward now related to this attack, is whether it's only inspired or if there's a component where it might have been guided specifically by operatives of the Islamic State, which we just don't know yet.
Many questions, as you say, Aaron, remain unanswered at this point, very early in the investigation. Thank you so much for your time on the programme. That is Aaron Y. Zallan, an expert on jihadist groups at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy.